This is an exciting time in Scotland's story, and understanding our past will help us determine our future. And when Scotland's voice is heard, it charts the way forward. This is Scotland Speaks with Salmond.
Good morning and welcome to Scotland Speaks with Salmond at our usual time at 10 a.m. on a Saturday morning.
After the Euros and during the Open.
Yes, indeed, after the football. And this week we turn to the very important subject of the oil and gas industry. And we'll look at the fallout from Labour's plans for it. Here are some of the headlines you will have read in the past week.
Yes, Ed Miliband caused consternation when he apparently announced a total ban on drilling in the North Sea, with the implications for tens of thousands of jobs. Now, the report in the Telegraph was subsequently denied by Ed Miliband's department, but concerns remain.
And of course, to discuss the North East, we should indeed turn to the North East and Fergus Mutch of True North, who will discuss the future of the oil and gas industry with Salmond.
Fergus Mutch, True North are advisors to many of the most significant developers in the North Sea, so last week's Telegraph front page must have caused a bit of consternation among your clients.
We advise a number of companies working in the North Sea energy sector. That's both on the oil and gas side of things, but also, these are generally the same companies that are at the forefront of investment in renewable energy too. And yes, I think it's fair to say that there is some uncertainty, some unease about what the future might hold for the North Sea. There's been a great amount of effort put into helping an incoming Labour government understand a bit better how this integrated energy system works. It's not oil and gas in one column, it's not renewables in the other column, it's not supply chain in the other column. These all depend on each other, and actually ensuring that we get the transition right and ensuring there's no cliff edge, that there's no drastic losses in terms of jobs, or indeed that the workforce chooses to up sticks and move elsewhere. This is a global industry. They can work, largely speaking, anywhere throughout the world. So there's certainly a huge amount of unease, and I would say from the sector's point of view, a real willingness to engage with the new government to make sure that they perhaps don't make some of the mistakes that the previous Conservative government was guilty of in terms of regular changes to the fiscal regime, a lack of certainty, a lack of clarity on where the sector was headed.
But Fergus Mutch, the Labour plans, in contrast to most of other areas where the manifesto commitments were somewhat vague, but the plans in the North Sea were pretty specific when they cited both an extension to the windfall tax and, crucially, an ending of investment allowances. Now, while that's not the same thing as having a ban on all drilling, an ending investment allowances would have roughly the same effect, would it not? It would be tens of thousands of jobs.
The removal of allowances would be bad news indeed. The kind of rhetoric around no new licenses beyond those already permitted would also be extremely bad news. The sector needs confidence. It also needs a pipeline of work if it's going to keep going. I think they were slightly more explicit, let's say, when they made these announcements, first of all, back in February. And they perhaps spent a few months rolling back on them, giving themselves a little bit more wriggle room to deal with the facts of the matter. The facts of the matter being now that the Labour Party are in government, and they will be having these conversations with senior Treasury officials and senior officials within DESNZ. One, we need the energy security that is afforded by the North Sea to ensure that the lights remain on and we can heat our homes. But also, there is a fiscal reality too, that this is a sector that drives significant revenues via the Exchequer, which fund the policy proposals that Labour have also included in their manifesto, which they will want to see rolled out.
Now, thanks much. You're a North Sea loon yourself, and indeed the True North as a company are full of North Sea loons and quines. So you'll know many of the potentially tens of thousands of workers who would be affected by a cliff edge in the North Sea. So that must give you some personal skin in the game, as well as being an economic and political advisor.
There's an element of ignorance to how these arguments are played out at a political level, because for those of us who live, work, have grown up in the Northeast, who understand this sector well, whose friends and family work in this sector, it's not, it's wrong to characterize this as, a bunch of fat cats driving around and, their big 4x4s, and all is rosy and these are money grabbing so-and-sos.
So that's describing the farming sector, is it not?
Could possibly call it. You were a rural constituency MSP for long enough, Alec. You can answer that one yourself. But the reality is, these are ordinary folk. These are good, honest workers. These are everybody from managerial level right down to your welders, to your fabricators, and actually the energy sector to the northeast of Scotland has been the passport to get on in life. It's been the passport to open doors, to travel around the world, to make a really decent living. And yeah, I think it's certainly the case that alarm bells are ringing about what the future might hold. These are people who are eager to move into the new green technologies of the future. But the fact is, the jobs simply do not exist at the sort of scale that they currently exist in oil and gas. And also, the salaries at present don't match those that they can achieve in the oil and gas sector. So they're looking to a government to lend a hand, to give confidence to the sector, sure, to do what it can to accelerate that drive to renewables. But if it's saying to them, the industry you work in is not worth a damn, and the job that you work in is a dirty industry and should be closed down, then naturally that is gonna set alarm bells ringing.
But you see things from Ed Miliband's point of view as well. I mean, okay, his job is not at risk, his livelihood's not at risk, but unless he keeps his promises, he'll get orange paint dubbed in his office or in his Hampstead mansion. So can you see things from Ed Miliband's point of view, who's always been an enthusiast for squaring up to oil and gas?
I think just a couple of years ago, it was when COP26 came to Glasgow, there was a pretty decent consensus between the public at large, between industry and between government about where we needed to get to. So that's net zero by 2045 in Scotland's case, net zero by 2050 in the UK's case. And actually, there was a great deal of sort of collaboration towards that end. The risk is if one of the parties to that consensus then decide, no, we need to go faster and harder and play to whatever gallery they wish to play to, it can crash the whole thing. So you get workers worried, leaving the workforce. You get businesses saying, "Well, we'll withdraw our investment from this this market and go elsewhere." And that's when you get real problems creating. So I hope indeed that between both the governments that Scotland has representing it, the workforce, the people at large, and industry, we can get back to that consensus toward what needs to be achieved. And of course, that is to achieve net zero and to meet the climate obligations that are upon the UK. But you need to do it in a balanced and managed transition.
So what is that balanced, managed transition? Is there a way forward which reconciles continued oil and gas development with the future of the planet?
I think there is. I think particularly in the North Sea context, when realistically we are now a net importer of oil and gas, and we also require a great deal of fossil fuels to fulfill our current energy requirements. The problem is if you grow that deficit between supply and demand even more, then you're just relying on imports to meet the demand. So relying on imports means they are more costly, they're less secure, and they're also in most cases more carbon heavy. So if you're importing liquefied natural gas from elsewhere in the world, it tends to come with 4 times the carbon footprint as it would to just use your own. So in that case, there could be a very, very compelling climate and environmental case for using North Sea oil and gas, and using that while we wind down our requirement for it over a managed transition. And that transition will most likely would take 10 to 15 years to reach net zero, and then beyond that we'll still require oil and gas within our energy mix for years to come.
Fergus Mutch of True North, thank you very much for joining me in Scotland Speaks with Alex Salmond.
Thank you very much.
Coming up after the break, Alex will discuss whether there is an alternative future for oil and gas in the northeast of Scotland that's compatible with the future of the planet. Join us then. Welcome back. Now we turn again to Alex, who's interviewing the world's first professor of carbon capture, Stuart Hazeldine of Edinburgh University. Over to Alex.
Now, Professor Hazeldine, you must be a bit frustrated because you've been a professor of carbon capture, the world's first professor of carbon capture, for 20 years, almost since you were appointed, and yet the carbon capture is still awaiting to be delivered at scale in the North Sea. So how do you cope with that frustration?
Well, I think the frustration shows how misguided a lot of the business conversation is and a lot of the political conversation is, because clearly the world cannot carry on just producing and burning fossil fuels because there's a very clear climate impact. So to carry on exploring for oil and gas, producing oil and gas, and avoiding capturing and storing that carbon dioxide, avoiding that's just a crazy make-believe that everything's going to be okay. So that has to change.
So how feasible would it be to put a licence condition, instead of on one hand, as the previous government did, waving through the licences almost willy-nilly, or the current government says it's going to do, stopping licences altogether? How feasible would it be to put a licence condition of carbon abatement, carbon capture on every single licence?
Well, I think that's a key and very good proposition, and that's a proposition that ourselves in the University of Edinburgh and colleagues in the University of Oxford have been promoting since about 2015. that the ability to produce more fossil carbon from the ground should be linked with an obligation of returning the fossil carbon to the ground, because what we need as a society is the energy from that, and we don't need the carbon dioxide. That's a waste. So just like many other items you might buy, we need to recycle and put the waste back where it came from, the same as recycling a car for its components, for example, or dismantling electrical equipment. We don't just throw that away. We have to, with the sale of that comes the obligation to do the cleanup. And that's what we need to do for this energy industry.
And why are you so confident that carbon capture will work at scale in the North Sea when it's been less than totally successful elsewhere in the world?
Well, there's a lot of conversation about being less than successful, but I think we need to look at that in a little bit more granular detail. So there's lots of carbon capture going on in the world, because most carbon capture is separating carbon dioxide, which naturally occurs with methane, natural gas, when it's produced. And so the biggest carbon capture and storage project in the world is a commercial project separating about 6 million tons a year of carbon dioxide from methane so that the methane can be sold. What happens to that carbon dioxide is then a different thing. And with that particular project, only part of it's put back underground and the rest of it's vented. And that's because there's no or very little monetary value attached to the carbon dioxide. You get paid for selling methane, but you don't get paid for putting carbon dioxide back in the ground. And so to us, that's the missing link. You have to make it valuable enough and commercial enough that commercial companies become interested, because they can do that good thing for the environment, but also get paid for doing that. And obviously that will be a little bit extra cost. Same as I have to pay for my rubbish to get taken away by the council. I'm very happy to pay that little extra cost, because that's better than throwing it out of the window. With carbon dioxide, we're all still used to throwing it out the window, and that's got to stop. And the extra cost involved is tiny compared with the benefits for the global climate and the future of the world as we know it.
So what you're suggesting, Professor Hazeldine, is effectively creating a market in carbon capture, where you'll be able to either use it and be paid for capturing your own carbon capture, or penalised for not doing it, and therefore creating a market which won't just involve the technical issue of capturing carbon, but will actually potentially make a vast profit by storing other people's carbon dioxide.
That's exactly right. And so what the difficulty is just starting this off to give companies and businesses the confidence that they're not going to be out there on their own bearing that extra expense of storage, but there's a national policy system which means that everybody has to store the carbon dioxide. So any supplier of fossil fuel, coal, oil or gas, any supplier has to do that mandated carbon dioxide storage. And of course, that doesn't need to be a cliff edge. That can come in saying we want you to store 5% of your carbon dioxide next year, and then the year after you store 10%, and by 2040 we want you to store 80% of your carbon dioxide. So there's a clear pathway which fits with the climate decrease of carbon dioxide which is needed, so the science can inform that pathway, and that gives a very clear and confident set of firm rules to oil and gas companies about storing carbon dioxide and getting paid for it. And that's what oil and gas companies have always said that they've wanted, but they've been very slow to actually enact it because the government hasn't helped by putting that mandate in place. And I think now there are several legal pointers which are pointing exactly in that direction, and very soon there's plenty of opportunities now to make this change if the government wants to.
And you're referring there to this recent Supreme Court ruling, which was about an onshore field development in England, but you think that would be applicable to offshore developments and the requirement to do something like carbon capture if future development is going to be legal?
That's again absolutely correct, Alex. So that the particular case is about a very small oil company in Surrey exploiting a very small oil field onshore. And the company obviously applied to the county council for planning permission, as you have to do. And part of that planning permission has to be an environmental impact assessment, which is a routine type of thing to do. Previously, oil companies have just had that waved through just by saying, well, we'll spend a bit of carbon and a bit of energy on drilling holes, and we'll spend a bit of energy on transporting the oil. But the legal case here was brought by Friends of the Earth and a private individual. And that went through the county council, it went through to judicial review, and eventually ended up in the Supreme Court, which is the top court of the UK. And that top court decided that the objectors were correct in that the environmental impact effects of the oil and gas production added carbon dioxide to the global atmosphere, and that would be a detriment, not just for the citizens of Surrey, but for the whole world. So just saying you were going to sell that oil to an adjacent oil refinery was not a good enough excuse. You still had to take responsibility for the final fate of that carbon dioxide. So that is now a legal judgment by the Supreme Court. And of course, that's the top court of the UK. This is not a human rights issue, so there's no European Court of Human Rights to go to for this. And this was a judgment under the environmental impact assessment, which is the European environmental impact assessment, European law, which was in force in the UK, and I think is still in force in the UK. So this judgment applies to every judgment in the UK in future, and will apply in future to every judgment in Europe. And because the UK has a legal system which has founded a lot of other legal systems around the world, this type of judgment will also apply in those jurisdictions as well. So this has potential to be a revolutionary change that anybody wanting to develop new oil or new gas out of the ground has to include a statement of how they're going to mitigate or reduce or eliminate the impact of that carbon on the climate. And that gives an open door for any new exploration and production to be mandated, i.e. forced to do carbon cleanup with carbon capture and storage in the North Sea, as well as the onshore UK, and indeed anywhere in Europe. So this is a really important judgment.
So if you could have 5 minutes with Ed Miliband, the new Energy Secretary, and would you be able to say to him, look, Secretary of State, instead of banning drilling in the North Sea and flinging tens of thousands of people into unemployment, into an uncertain future, why don't you at least try the carbon capture route and see if we can reconcile development with the future of the planet? Would you enjoy having that 5 minutes? And would you convince them, Stuart?
Well, I would relish having that long elevator 5-minute moment. And I think I would make exactly the case I've made to you just now legally, but I would also make the case economically that what Ed Miliband's talking about may be closing down the oil industry, exploration and production overnight. And that's jumping off a cliff edge into the unknown. And we can see from the recent disturbance of oil and gas supply from Russia that jumping off a cliff edge all of a sudden can give you very big economic effects. So a smarter way of doing this is to take a slope on the off-ramp and realize that the detrimental effects of oil and gas production are the carbon dioxide. The energy from oil and gas is good, it's cheap, it's portable, it's uniquely accessible, but we need to mitigate those carbon dioxide emissions. So saying you can carry on exploring and producing oil and gas, that could happen, but it has to be conditional on that carbon dioxide being captured and stored by the company doing that exploration for the oil and gas. And that's an economic benefit. That gives new skills and new technologies to come into the North Sea, building those carbon dioxide capture and storage projects, because I think the Environment Agency is saying that they're seeing something like 130 new carbon dioxide capture projects in prospect for the next 18 months. So this is a revolution we're starting to live through. The UK has licensed 21 storage sites in the offshore. We haven't got the carbon dioxide to send there at the moment, but we can import carbon dioxide from other countries around Europe who have no storage of their own. And most importantly, we can store our own carbon dioxide and be a clean and profitable country by doing that. So this is a golden opportunity to shoot two birds with one stone, and to turn that aside without even analysing it would be a very an equally bad decision as just continuing willy-nilly without doing it. So Ed Miliband should perhaps take the more subtle route into the future.
Professor Stuart, Hazeldine, myself and tens of thousands of offshore workers will be saying more power to your elbow. Thank you for joining me at Scotland Speaks with Alex Salmond.
It's a pleasure. Anytime. Thank you.
Water is life, but not all water is equal. Our water ionizer restructures and alkalizes water for optimum hydration and detoxification, recreating the planet's ultimate water sources, found in lightning-struck lakes and newly melted icebergs. H2 Pure Source. Change your water. Change your life.
Welcome back. Now, last week's show, which proved extremely popular, was of course examining the fallout from the UK general election, when Alex spoke to Alex Neil, former Cabinet Secretary in the Scottish Government, and then to Neil Hanvey, the former MP for Kirkcaldy and Cowdenbeath.
What's your central criticism of the SNP's election campaign and their general approach to politics just now?
Well, I think the campaign is the culmination of 2 or 3 years of absolute chaos in terms of leadership, in terms of the independent strategy, and quite frankly, the chickens coming home to roost in some public services where the necessary action and investment hasn't taken place over the last 3 or 4 or 5 years. Culminating also, of course, in the background with the branch form investigation and more recently the Michael Matheson fiasco. So when you add all that together, plus a pretty poor campaign with no clear message, no clear, credible strategy on independence, then I think we were in for a drubbing. And I have to say, I myself forecast that we would end up with fewer than 10 seats, because anyone who is speaking to people on the doorstep would know full well what people were thinking about the Scottish National Party.
I made a commitment to myself back in 2010 that I would do everything I possibly could to deliver Scotland's independence. That has not, desire has not diminished for me one iota. It has guided all of the decisions that I've made, whether people agree with those decisions or not. I believe I'm doing these things and making those choices because it's in the best interests of the people of Scotland. And so I expect to, certainly be putting myself forward for selection for Alapa in 2026. That's something I would be hopeful for the party's support on. and hopefully in the interim period be out there speaking to independent supporters and building up the profile of Alba in the minds of the public.
And this is what you had to say about last week's show. Eleanor says, Alex Neil talking a lot of sense. He was a sore loss to Scottish politics when he retired. All the Gear But No Idea says, as a pro-union supporter, I love to watch these videos. Some of the points brought up I agree with and others not so much. Always good to see the point of view from the other side of the argument. Thank you very much indeed. The Honest Jock says, the reality is the SNP have achieved absolutely nothing in terms of independence over the last 10 years. Instead, there was an arrogance of power developed over that time. The SNP were too used to winning, but they forgot how to win. The independent supporter vote was taken for granted, but after 10 years of negligence of the issue, many have had enough, myself included. Well, Honest Jock, all I can say is you must not lose the faith. Tara's Gal says, an excellent show. Of all the post-mortems I've heard regarding General Election 24, I reckon Alex Neil's summation was the clearest and hit the bullseye every time. He obviously listened to what was being said on the doorsteps and not what he chose to hear. I hope the right people listened to him. And finally, Indie Boy says, that was a great watch. Delighted that Neil Hanvey has confirmed he plans to stand as an Alba candidate in the 2026 Holyrood elections, and I'm confident he'll get the backing. I believe he'll not only help Alba make a political breakthrough, but a breakthrough for independence. Thank you, Indie Boy, and so say all of us. Thank you very much indeed for all of your comments, and please do keep them coming in. And remember to give us ideas for topics for our future shows. Now we turn to Alex for his final thoughts on the future of oil and gas in the northeast of Scotland, and indeed about the future of the planet. Over to Alex.
Well, don't say you weren't warned. And during the election campaign, there was plenty of discussion about the implications of Labour's policy for the North Sea. And in truth, of course, Labour don't need to ban drilling to decimate tens of thousands of jobs in the northeast of Scotland and through the country. All they have to do is to go ahead with the programme, which is to extend the windfall tax and, more crucially, to cut investment allowances. If you ban investment allowances, you effectively ban investment. If you ban investment, then that's a quick route to banning tens of thousands of jobs. So these things were well laid out in the election campaign, and it's probably actually the reason that Labour failed to win the 2 Aberdeen seats in the election. They won everywhere else just about, but not the 2 Aberdeen seats. Of course, the opposition to Labour was hindered by the fact that the Tories have spent generations pillaging Scotland's resources and therefore don't have credibility on the subject. Well, the SNP got themselves into a fankle with their Green allies and saying there should be a presumption against future development, so they were hardly in the greatest position to criticise Labour. But we are where we are. There is a new Labour government and there's a very real threat to the North Sea industry. And the tragedy is that this is totally unnecessary because there is a solution which will both keep the North Sea industry on the road in terms of oil and gas and accelerate the way to a cleaner, greener future for all of us. And that is not to ban oil and gas licences, but to make a licence condition that every single investment must have a carbon capture proposal. And as we've heard from Professor Stuart Hazeldine, the chances are this will work in scale, and secondly, it's actually compatible with recent rulings from the Supreme Court. So here you have a legal route, an environmental route, an economic route to make sure that the North Sea industry retains its specialist workforce, and we ease our way not just to carbon capture and a cleaner planet, but also into the renewables revolution that has been much heralded but hasn't as yet been delivered at scale. Well, who am I to say all of this? Well, when I left office in 2014, Scotland as a country were 4% ahead of our greenhouse emission targets and delivered that 6 years early. So I've got a little bit of credibility in this subject. I think before we start reading the funeral rites over the North Sea, we should at least try carbon capture at scale. Who knows, it might not just work and do a substantial amount to save the planet, it might in itself be a lucrative business. And of course it would be some indication that those currently in charge of Scotland's resources would look at the last 50 years and say thank you for all the billions that have flowed into our coffers, and we're not going to fling you all in the scrap heap without so much as a by your leave. But listen, if you trust Westminster with Scotland's resources, whether it be remaining oil and gas or the future of deep sea renewables, then you're looking at the last 50 years and learning no lessons whatsoever. Because this story, the story that we've told today, is an argument for Scottish control over Scotland's resources, and that's an argument for independence. And now over to Taz to close out today's show.
And with that, sadly, we come to the end of another episode of Scotland Speaks with Alex Salmond. But worry not, if you've missed some of the show, you can catch up on all of it and all of the usual social media channels. And of course, we look forward to seeing you again next week, same time, same place, 10 o'clock on a Saturday morning. Until then, take good care. Bye for now.
This is an exciting time in Scotland's story, and understanding our past will help us determine our future. And when Scotland's voice is heard, it charts the way forward. This is Scotland Speaks with Alex Salmond.